Hello, in this video we are exploring the Isosceles triangle theorem. The Isosceles triangle theorem says that if a triangle has two congruent sides, it must have two congruent angles. So let's look at our picture. We have two congruent sides. It also says that if we have two congruent sides, we need to have two congruent angles. Similarly, if a triangle has two congruent angles, it must have two congruent sides. So basically what this is all saying is that if you have a triangle with two congruent sides, you can automatically assume that it has two congruent angles. And vice versa. If you have a triangle with two congruent angles, you can automatically assume that it has two congruent sides. That's the Isosceles triangle theorem. So keep that in mind as we go through the next examples. We have a triangle. We want to find the length of ST. So ST is this side length over here. So let's look at what we know and keep in mind our Isosceles triangle theorem. Well, first, if we look at our angles, we have an angle measure of 64 and another angle measure of 64. So we have a triangle that has two congruent angles. So our theorem says it must also have two congruent sides. The sides that will be congruent are the ones opposite those congruent angles. So opposite this 64 would be this side, and opposite this 64 would be this side. Those two sides must be congruent. So ST would also have to be 13 centimeters. Example number 2. Find the measures of the two missing angles. So let's look at what we know, keeping in mind our Isosceles triangle theorem. Well, we have two congruent sides in our triangle. And our theorem says if a triangle has two congruent sides, it must also have two congruent angles. So, across from both 6 centimeter sides, those two angles must be congruent. So because this angle is 47, this angle must also be 47 degrees. And now to find the measure of the third angle, I'm going to use our triangle sum theorem. All three angles in a triangle must add up to 180. So if we work backwards and go 180 minus 47 minus 47, type it in my calculator, we get 86 degrees. Example number 3. We have a little bit more of a complex picture here, but let's keep in mind our Isosceles triangle theorem. In our picture, you can see that we have two sides that are congruent. Our theorem says that if a triangle has two congruent sides, it must have two congruent angles. So let's figure out which angles need to be congruent. Well, those are the ones opposite the congruent sides. So angle B and angle G need to be congruent. So because angle B is x plus 10, angle G must also be x plus 10. So now let's actually find the value of x. Well, I have three angles in my triangle. Because of the triangle sum theorem, I know that all three angles added together need to add up to 180. So I can make a fairly large equation here, adding all three angles together and making it equal 180. Now let's solve this equation. 3 plus 1 makes 5x. 10 plus 10 makes 20. And it still equals 180. Now if I subtract 20 from both sides, I get 5x equals 160. And then if I take 160 and divide by 5, I get 32. So x equals 32. But now I'm being asked to find the measure of each angle. To do this, I'm going to take my answer of x equals 32 and substitute it into each of my expressions in the triangle. So to find the measure of angle B, I'm going to take x equals 32 and substitute that in to x plus 10. So 32 plus 10 would make 42 degrees for angle B. Let's do the same thing for angle G. Substitute in my x value, so 32 plus 10. Angle G is also 42 degrees. Lastly, let's do that for angle U. So 3 times 32 would make 96 degrees. Now let's pause for a second and look at these three numbers. They are the three angles from my triangle, so if we add them up together, they should make 180. And if you check in your calculator, 42 plus 96 will equal 180 degrees total, which is exactly what it should because this is a triangle. So it's kind of a nice built-in way to check our work. One more example. Again, we want to keep our isosceles triangle theorem in mind. In this triangle, we have two congruent sides. If a triangle has two congruent sides, it must have two congruent angles. So which angles are going to be congruent? Well, the ones across from the congruent sides. So angle M is also 4y minus 15. Just like in the last problem, now that we have three angle measures, we can use the triangle sum theorem. All three angles added together need to equal 180 degrees. So we make an equation where we add them all together and put equals 180 at the end. Let's solve. 7 plus 4 makes 15y. Negative 15 plus negative 15 makes negative 30. Add 30 to each side, and we get 210. And then if we go 210 divided by 15, we can find the value of y, which is 14. Now, let's substitute our value of y into each expression to figure out the measure of each angle. So for angle M, I'm going 4 times 14 minus 15, which makes 41 degrees. Angle N will be 7 times 14, which makes 98 degrees. And angle O, that was the same as angle M, so it's 41 degrees. And if I double check myself by adding all three of these angles together, I get 180 degrees total. So I definitely know I have done this problem correctly.